Today we are in chapter 5 of the book White Fragility. What if I told you that we could not be racist? It's kind of like telling people, and I'm talking about humans now, I'm talking about white people, I'm talking about humanity here. It's like telling us that we could be sinless. Imagine, and this goes back to Jesus having such trouble with the Pharisees. The Pharisees had actually come to a place where they believed that they were sinless, that they were in good, perfect standing with God the Father because they were keeping the law perfectly. I think Paul was one of the ones to finally come out and admit that as far as the law was concerned, he considered himself blameless, but realized that his relationship with the living God was far from where it ought to be because he did not understand the bridge built by Jesus, and that the bridge he was trying to build with his sinlessness, he thought, was going to get him there, and he realized that that was not going to happen. Well, when it comes to humanity, to all of us, we have within us prejudices and the other differences between male and female, and between people of color and people of other cultures. All of this feeds into this world that we live in. And so one of the greatest problems that we get into in our dealings with other people is that we get this actual idea that I can't be racist. I'm not racist. And what she says in chapter 5 is that there's a good-bad binary. And what she means by that is that you can't be a good person and be racist. That's what only bad people are racist. And so she said that in our culture over the past decades, this understanding began to be sort of absorbed by all of us in American culture. Racist is bad because people that are racist are ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, typically old, and more than likely Southern. These are not correct, these are not accurate, but these are the stereotypes of that. Not racist, which equals good, is a person that's progressive, open-minded, open minds, open hearts, open doors. We say that in the Methodist Church as something to aspire to, not where we are. That we are educated, that educated people can't be racist, that we are open-minded people, we are well-intentioned people, typically we're younger people. All of this has been proven not to be accurate, and that they're northern people. That's not true. I was reminded again when the busing situation broke out in Boston, and I thought, we've already been through this. And here they are still going through it. When they had that Juneteenth celebration, when years after Emancipation Proclamation, the troops, Northern troops, Union troops, finally got to Texas and emancipated the slaves there. Guess what? That did not emancipate the slaves in the North. And there was slavery in certain states in the North. And so we understand that these are inaccurate things to say. So what that gets us into is when we start talking about race, it starts painting us with a racial bias. And so to suggest that I'm a racist is to deliver a deep moral blow to me, a kind of character assassination. And you can see that clearly in the struggles that Jesus had with the Pharisees. Because when he would speak to them that you are not fulfilling your covenant with God in the ways it should be, he was insinuating to them that they were sinners. And they had already created the haves and the have-nots, the sinners and the non-sinners. And it was a great moral blow to them to hear Jesus say that. And their idea was, well, we got to kill this man because he's calling this out, and we don't want to hear it. So the good-bad binary makes it nearly impossible for white people to talk about racism. It's a limited view. The truth is all people hold prejudices, especially race, but also there's economic prejudice, there is male and female prejudice, mansplaining, the Me Too movement. You understand where all that came from. We've been discovering, as I've been watching and podcasts, listening to podcasts, watching certain documentaries or other shows that showed that even in the civil rights movement, the men dominated the camera and the platform, and the women who were so instrumental in this were pushed to the side, were sent to the margins. So it happens in all of these situations. It's white superiority is in our bedrock. She says, I will be seen as white, treated as white, experience life as a white person. We've talked about this. It's the water that we fish swim in. So it's part of what we're dealing with. So a simplistic idea that racism is limited to the individual intentional acts committed by unkind people, that's at the root of the problem here. It's at the root of all of our white defensiveness when we ever try to talk about the problem. And why are we trying to talk about it? If we don't, we'll never make progress towards dealing with it, coming up with ways to cope with it. It reminds me of a person, whether they're dealing with an addiction or whether they're dealing with some sort of mental illness. There are coping strategies that they must learn to accept who they are as an alcoholic, an addict, or schizophrenic, or bipolar. Whatever the problem is, they have to learn to cope with it. They can't deny it away, and they cannot cure it. It'll never be cured. It's something that they must learn to cope with. So they need coping strategies. That's why we're trying to talk about it. It won't ever get better if we're not willing to admit who we are and then talk about what we can do to move past that. So what happens is, if we're not racist, as we like to call ourselves, then what further action is required of me? No action is required, because I am not a racist. Therefore, racism is not my problem. That might be some other people's problem, but not me. I will not build my skills in thinking critically about racism or use my position in life, my position as an educator, as a pastor, as a boss, as a manager, wherever you are in society. I won't use that as a way to challenge racial inequity, because it's not my problem, and therefore nothing gets done about it. She tells a story about working with a group of educators, and the title of her workshop was Seeing the Water, talking about fish swimming in water, trying to see the water, whiteness in our daily life. This presentation is designed to make visible the relentless messages of white superiority and the resulting and inevitable internalization of these messages that white people take into themselves. So this white teacher was telling the story that one of the parents of color was sort of getting in her face about the fact that she did not understand her children. You don't understand my children. But in telling the story, she imitated the mother. And by her imitation, everyone in the room immediately knew this woman is giving us a stereotype of a black mother. There was no doubt. It was bordering, the author says, on racial mockery. And she was trying to tell the story to understand that she had come to the conclusion as a teacher that she really didn't understand people of color. But now there was a whole nother problem sitting in the room. There was an elephant sitting in the table. as a white presenter, she was struggling with the fact, do I call out this person of my color for using a prejudicial stereotype in the telling of the story? A white person who billed herself as a racial justice consultant, no less, was put in the awkward position of having to point out to this person that her telling of the story was in itself racist. So she says, I'm going to ask you to consider not telling the story in that way again. And she laid out what was problematic about race in the way she told her story, because she was reinforcing a racial stereotype. I'm tempted in even telling the story to try to imitate whatever I would think the racial stereotype would be. But then would that not be me promulgating or bringing it forward, keep carrying it forward, this same kind of prejudice? So she's saying, don't do that, because the imitation of the mother that you gave was racially charged. Now, after she got through it, and the woman was defensive several times in dealing with this, the way the story was told. It says several African American teachers came up first and says, thank you, because I was behind my mask, I was rolling my eyes, because this is part of what I have to deal with every day. But several white people came up and approached her to let her know that that teacher was very upset that she had been called out and that she was quitting the group. So a person who had deliberately signed up for a seminar about white racism could not handle feedback on how her racism was unintentionally manifesting itself. This is the bad good issue here. Rather than accepting that she was racist and saying, oh, that's all, understanding and learning from it. And also understand that all of us would feel defensive in that case. Because in this bad good dichotomy that we're presenting here, we would be, by being told that we had done something in a racist manner, would mean what? That I'm a bad person. Don't tell me I'm a sinner. Don't tell me I'm a bad person. And I'll get very defensive about that. So this leads another story that she tells about, a true story of a West Virginia county employee. I think the other story was true. I'm just saying that this is something that was in the news. A lady named Pamela, she held a position as a director of county development. And she posted these remarks about Michelle Obama. She said on Facebook, I think, that it would be so refreshing to have a classy, beautiful, dignified First Lady back in the White House. I'm tired of seeing an ape in heels. And then the mayor of the city in West Virginia responded to her and said, you just made my day, Pam. And so he gets called out. And it starts this whole racial issue, incident that happened amongst these elected officials. And he says, my comment was not intended to be racist at all. I was referring to my day being made for a political change in the White House. I'm sorry for any hard feelings this may have caused, but I'm not in any way racist. Although Pamela was suspended, she got her job back, and the author of this book says, I'm really confounded at times what actually qualifies as racism in the white mind. When I talk to white people about racism, I hear the same claims that are rooted in this good-bad binary. And she wants to now present to us two overall categories that this good-bad gets put into. First are claims of color blindness. I don't see color. Race has no meaning to me. Well, she's already pointed out that most of us who are white, we don't live with race in front of us every day, because the majority, we are the supreme dominant culture. so we don't see it anyway. The second claim claims to value diversity. Hey, I know people of color. I've got them near me. I work with them. I'm free of racism. I've got them in my family. You've got all these different ways that it's talked about. And it positions the speaker then, the person who makes these claims, as a good person, free of racism, and therefore, hey, end of discussion, right? End of discussion. I don't want to talk about it anymore. So colorblind claims include the following. I was taught to treat everyone the same. I don't see color. Race doesn't have meaning to me. My parents weren't racist, therefore I'm not racist. Everyone struggles, but if you work hard in America. Children today, they're going to be our salvation. They're not racist. I'm not racist. I'm from Canada. That's one of the ones she listed here. I grew up poor, so I didn't have racial privilege. The second term, the second set, the color celebrate. They see and embrace racial differences. I work in a diverse environment. I have people of color in my family. I married a person of color. I have children of color. I was in the military. I've been world traveled. I was in the Peace Corps. I even marched in the 60s. And it goes on and on and on with the great ways that we class ourselves in the color celebrate. And so she says, in my work to unravel the dynamics of racism, she wants to really know, when you make statements like this, how does this claim function in the conversation that we're having right now? Because she claims, she's struggling that all of these claims ultimately function in a very similar way. They exempt the person from responsibility or for participation in the problem of racism. In other words, they want to take race off the table. And what this ends up doing is it protects the racial status quo. She goes on to talk about how a pier over a lake would appear to float, but there's a structure underneath it. And we have to get at that structure if we're going to make any difference. We have to ask ourselves, how do we define racism? Do we use this good-bad dichotomy? Everyone who claims to have been taught to treat everyone the same is simply telling me that they don't understand socialization. We can't successfully be taught to do this because human beings are not objective. It's just not in our DNA. We're going to be racist. We're going to see matters in terms of gender, in terms of class, and in terms of color. We all do this. And so when people say statements like that, those who are on the other side of it, whether it be a other gender or an other race, another culture, they see the white person making these statements as just being clueless, unaware of the realities in which they live. It's like someone saying, I'm like this author, for instance, saying, I'm married to a man, therefore I have a gender-free life. No, it's a deep social construct. They'll wrestle with these differences between male and female throughout the life of their relationship. And it's similar with racism. It cannot be absent from a friendship. It cannot be absent from the culture. It cannot be absent from our economic ways of doing things. Silence is one of the ways that racism is manifest because it is truly an imposed silence. So she goes through several of these concepts and she breaks them all down. There's not time to do all of that, but if you were to tell someone that you can teach them not to judge, if you put them through a whole seminar about not judging, judge not lest you be judged. We teach that, we preach that, but at the end of all of that teaching, you would still continue to judge because it's the tendency of the person. We find ourselves doing it almost unconsciously. It's bringing it to our awareness that we're like, oh, I'm judging here. Only if we do that do we have a chance of counteracting it, of coping with it. I have to understand that if I'm around alcohol and I'm an alcoholic, I have to bring coping mechanisms into play to not drink. or I will do it unconsciously. So deeper reflection will not free us from unconscious treatment of others. It's inequitable. It's that we treat others differently and unequally. But if we can bring it to awareness, she says it'll get us closer and get us further along than outright denial of it. And I'm going to skip through so many of these other things except to say it's even true in our children. Children show they will not become less racially biased with age, that they just learn to hide the racism in front of adults. Many whites see the naming of white racial power as divisive. You talking about race is racially divisive. For them, the problem is not the power of inequity itself. The problem is naming it. Naming breaks the pretense of unity. It exposes the reality of racial division and inequity in our culture. So in conclusion, she says, most of us have images from the civil rights conflict of the time, most of us alive now. And it's held up as the epitome of racism. But it's gotten much more subtle than that. I chanced to want to play you a discussion from a political, this is from last week tonight with John Oliver. Let me see if I can find where to play it.
And when you skip over the past half century, you don't get to see the process by which white supremacy, instead of disappearing, merely adapted. And perhaps nobody made that process clearer than Lee Atwater, a top Republican campaign strategist who worked for, among others, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Here he is, spelling out the whole game in 1981. And I'm going to warn you, you're about to hear the N-word a lot.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger, that hurts you.
68, you can't say it.
Like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff.
States' rights, forced busing.
You get it so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about.
Okay, so now we're getting into the true subtleties of how he's basically admitting that we've driven this underground more. It's more what's holding up the pier than what we're walking on. And you hear things like cutting taxes, forced busing.
Blacks get hurt worse than white.
And then I realized that right before Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, he was moving to the next phase of his civil rights workshop, his civil rights movement. And he's basically saying, this hasn't cost anybody anything yet. The voter rights and letting us sit at the white lunch counter. This hasn't cost anyone economically yet. But when we start moving into their neighborhoods, when we start demanding equal schools, when we start mixing together, and what I was challenging you with last week was that if we truly understand God's kingdom as all people, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was Mediterranean, olive-skinned person. That one of our first bishops was an African, Augustine. Sorry. So as we understand these great racial diversity that God so loves, then we have to understand we've got to become participants in moving ourselves out of our sin and into the light of God, which would move us into a kingdom of God where there is no more male and female, there is no more Jew nor Greek, that we are all seen in the light of God's grace. Now, when will that be perfect? When Jesus returns. But until then, we are to work towards God's kingdom. So we have to admit the fault and then move forward to do something about it. There's so many other ways that all this can be approached, but it's hard. It's difficult. She's saying, I actively seek to interrupt racism, to develop within ourselves coping mechanisms that will counteract the innate nature of my fallen self. That I will look at others, I judge, I see them as other if they're a different sex, if they're a different class, if they're a different color. And then I must become active, not just non-racist, but actively anti-racist to work towards doing something about that. And that's part of the definition of being a Christian.